If you want your drone shots to look amazing, you need to learn how to color grade them. And so in this video, I'm going to show you the top 7 techniques I use to color grade my drone shots and take them from looking like this to looking like this. And just FYI, this video is just one of over 25 tutorials in my drone color grading course, Drone Color Pro, and more on that later. But right now, let's dive into my top 7 keys for color grading drone shots. So principle number 1 is add contrast without losing dynamic range. So basically our brains are wired to like contrast. In general, an image with higher contrast is going to be more visually attractive than one with lower contrast. And the main way that we add contrast is through tonal contrast, or in other words, differences in brightness. When you increase the contrast, you make the bright parts of the image brighter and the dark parts of the image darker. And so because contrast makes things look good, we want to add as much contrast to our shots as we can. But as you increase the contrast, you'll start to lose detail in the brightest and darkest parts of the shot because the bright areas become pure white and the dark areas become pure black. And this is basically throwing away part of the dynamic range that the camera has captured, and it just doesn't look good. So we need to find ways of increasing contrast without losing dynamic range. And the way we do this is by expanding the range of the midtones, or in other words, taking the parts of the image that are neither very bright nor very dark, and making the brighter parts of that middle tonal range brighter and making the darker parts darker, but at the same time not making the very brightest parts any brighter because that would clip them to white, and not making the darkest parts any darker to avoid clipping them to black. And in the rest of the color section of the course, I'm going to show you how to actually achieve this using tools like highlights and shadows and masks, but the main principle is to have both high contrast and high dynamic range at the same time. Moving on to principle number 2, which is use masks. Now this is actually one of the tools that I used to achieve principle number 1, high contrast without losing dynamic range, but it's such an important part of how I color grade my shots and makes such a big difference that I think it deserves its own whole point. Using masks to select different parts of what you're color grading just gives you way more flexibility and control to be able to target exactly what you want to adjust, rather than having to apply all your adjustments to the whole image. Something I do all the time is to use masks to separate the ground and the sky to even out the exposure and be able to grade them separately, and just applying this one principle can make your shots 10 times better. Another thing you can do with masks is to select your subject and make it stand out more. Again, I teach the mechanics of how to use masks in a separate lesson, but for now, here are a couple more examples of the power of masks. Principle number 3 is have the right saturation. Saturation is basically how intense colors are, and again, our brains are naturally wired to like more saturated, more vibrant colors. So if you show most people 2 shots, one that's more saturated and one that's less saturated, and ask them which looks better, they'll usually pick the one with the more saturated colors. So we can make our shots look better or more attractive by increasing the saturation. But you have to be careful with this because if you increase the saturation too much, the colors start to look harsh and unnatural and just basically ugly. So you have to strike a balance between having pleasingly high saturation and just looking over the top. Now, one way to have more saturated colors without turning the whole shot into an oversaturated mess is to only increase the saturation of certain colors. This is what a lot of LUTs do. They increase the saturation of some colors and decrease the saturation of others, and you can do something similar manually with HSL curves. And that brings me to principle number 4, which is cinematic versus accurate colors. Some people, when they edit their photos and color grade their videos, they just try to make the colors match exactly as closely as possible what they were in real life, just try to get the colors as accurate as possible. And that's fine, but my goal in color grading isn't necessarily to precisely match how I would have seen the scene if I was there, but instead I want to convey the feeling of the scene and make it look as good as possible. And that usually doesn't mean perfectly accurate colors. Instead, I go for what could be called cinematic colors. And this is basically what looks the best and fits the scene. It might be more or less saturated than the quote-unquote accurate color. It might be shifted to look more like golden hour. Many times the colors will be shifted away from their original hue to a more cinematic color scheme, for example, some variation of orange and teal. Now, you don't want to go crazy with this. You don't want your footage to look totally unrealistic. You don't want the grass to be pink and the sky to be green. You still want to be within the bounds of reasonable reality reality, but just don't feel like you have to limit yourself to perfectly accurate colors. Now, there are some things like real estate videos where you're going to want to stick more closely to accurate colors. You don't want to have a real estate video with some really cinematic color grade that makes all the greens look desaturated and shifted toward yellow, because you want people to be able to see how the property actually looks. But for more creative, artistic projects, you have more freedom to push the colors to where they look good, even if that's not 100% realistic. Principle number 5 is create color contrasts. Not only do we like tonal contrast, but we also like contrasting colors. The most popular example of this is orange and teal. If you look at a color wheel, orange and teal are directly opposite from each other, which means they have the highest contrast to each other, and therefore they look pleasing together. Now, orange and teal has been overused. Some people just want to make everything in their shots either strong teal or strong orange, but the basic color combination of orange and teal, or more broadly combining warm tones and cool tones, is a very valid color grading technique. Now, you can only do so much to create color contrast in color grading unless you are just going to completely change the colors in your shots. But you can shift the hue of colors to be more in line with contrasting color schemes like teal and orange, and you can enhance, for example, the cool and warm contrast by making the cool parts of the image cooler and the warm parts of the image warmer. Principle number 6 is layer adjustments. Color grading isn't a one-step process. Most of my color grades have at least 2 or 3 nodes, or in other words, layers of adjustment. And for more complex color grades, that can be on up to 5 or 6 layers, and then sometimes another node or 2 on an adjustment layer over the whole video. Many times I'll have a node for correcting the log footage, then a couple of nodes with masks to edit different areas of the shot, then a node to add a little more contrast, then a LUT, etc. And sometimes I'll even add multiple LUTs at lower strength to get the look that I'm going for. In general, it's going to work better to make several smaller adjustments than one really big adjustment. So don't be afraid to layer on the adjustments. And finally, principle number 7 is focus on the subject. Whatever the subject of the shot is, that's what you're going to want to prioritize when you're color grading. You want the viewer's eyes to be drawn to the subject rather than distracted from it, so you want it to look the best compared to everything else in the frame. One way to apply this principle is to add a feathered mask to your subject that brightens it a little and adds some contrast to it and makes it stand out from the rest of the shot. Another application of focusing on the subject is to prioritize its dynamic range. For example, in this shot, I could have tried to keep all the detail in the highlights of the river, but the river isn't the main subject of my shot, so instead I prioritize the detail of the town, which is the subject, and let the river be washed out and up near the white clipping point. So if you can't have everything in the shot well exposed, always keep the detail in your subject and let some other part of the shot lose detail. So there you have my 7 principles of color grading. Obviously, this is just scratching the surface. We could go way more in depth and talk for hours about how to use color grading tools to apply these 7 principles. Color grading can be quite a complex and overwhelming skill to master, and so that's why I've created my new course, Drone Color Pro, to break everything down into clear, understandable tutorials and shorten your learning curve from months or years to just days or weeks. Inside Drone Color Pro, we have over 25 lessons breaking down each part of color correcting and grading shots in DaVinci Resolve, answering questions like how do nodes work, what do all these video scopes mean, how do I grade log footage, what should I use LUTs for, and many more. And we have a video walking you through where everything is and what everything does in Resolve, and then there are specific tutorials showing how to use curves, color wheels, masks, tracking, HSL curves, and much more. And then once you understand how all of the tools work, I show you in real time how I color grade 15 of my favorite shots, so you can see the thought process of how I analyze each shot and approach how to color grade it. And I also have lessons breaking down the color grades of several of my drone videos. And I include bonuses like all of my Flying Filmmaker LUTs and power grades, practice footage, and more. And yes, this course is included inside of my full Flying Filmmaker course, but I'm also selling it separately because I've had a lot of people specifically wanting to know about how I color grade my drone shots. So if you want to master color grading, go click the link in the description to learn more and join Drone Color Pro, or you can join the full Flying Filmmaker course, which has Drone Color Pro included in it. So guys, that's it for this video. Make sure to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already so you don't miss future videos. And if you'd like to see another video about how to improve your drone shots, you can click here on the screen, and we'll see you in the next video.